Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod, and this is Star Wars 7x7, your daily dose of Star Wars joy. And thank you so much for joining me for it. And thank you especially to the patrons who help make this possible for you with their support at patreon.com/SW7x7, and in particular with their support for this episode, because the Acolyte season finale is happening tonight. I'm recording this the day before, and this episode actually drops, depending on whether you're catching the audio version or the video version, many hours, well, it's many hours either way, before the finale actually debuts on Disney Plus. And what I did last week, after episode 7 happened, is I reached out to the people who are supporting this show and said, what do you think? What do you think is going to happen in this final episode of season 1? Let me hear your predictions. So I thought I would share with you some of those. I'd be curious to know if they line up with yours or if you disagree with them, however you feel about it. I'd love to hear. So if you're catching this on YouTube, comments are right there. Just, get your predictions in before the episode drops, right? Because that's only fair. Or the Q&A section on Spotify or anywhere else. Head to the blog post for this show's episode at sw7x7.com. Let me know what you think. So I'm going to share with you some of the feedback I got from patrons of the podcast. Ryan O'Loughlin says that he thinks Saul's sun will set. And yeah, clever wordplay, but basically he says that he thinks that Saul has to die, that he's the last Jedi standing who saw Darth Manny, which is just as good of a name for Darth Chimere as any other, right? And James Traverse goes one step further. He says Saul, May, and Chimere will all die, but then goes on to say Vernestra will then take Osha on as her new Sith apprentice. I think that last part is tongue-in-cheek, at least the part about Vernestra being the Sith master, but the idea of Osha becoming a Sith apprentice, yeah, I can kind of see that. But I think it requires a set of circumstances to come to pass, which we'll talk about momentarily. As far as everybody else dying, well, certainly that would resolve the question of Sith Lords and Ki-Adi-Mundi's statement that nobody's seen a Sith forever and ever in The Phantom Menace, but there are a lot of ways around that also that we've talked about here on the show, and certainly the Jedi are no strangers to cover-ups. That said, Leslie Headland has demonstrated that no one is safe in this show. She has killed off characters that it really seemed like ought to survive just based on how, ongoing series TV works. In that sense, Leslie Headland has created a true High Republic show, because if you have at all followed High Republic storytelling in other media, or you're connected with High Republic fans on social media, you will be familiar with the idea that the High Republic authors are brutal. They kill off characters left and right, and no one is safe. For myself, I think Osha is going to survive the events of the Acolyte, and everybody else, I think their fate is entirely up in the air, complete coin toss. Even Vernestra, who at this point is well over 100 years old, under the presumption that Chimere is in fact a former and failed apprentice of Vernestra Rwoh, I can see a situation where Chimere gets a shot at revenge, although I can also see a situation where that's part of a season 2, because Leslie Headland has mapped out a whole series Bible that goes beyond the events of season 1. Then Dale Erdman did me a solid and saved me from going back and watching trailers and commercials and teasers and whatnot by looking at what footage hasn't appeared in The Acolyte so far. In his reply, he says, guessing from the scenes we haven't seen, they'll return to Bnic but visit the moons, perhaps inadvertently crashing on them, one or both. And then he also goes on to say Vernestra and Mog are still on Bnic, says we'll visit more than one world in the finale, that they may end up heading back to Coruscant. May and Saul are on their way somewhere, and I'm going to interject and say I assume they're heading back to Coruscant. That seems to be where Saul's mind is going. Osha and Chimere are on an island planet, and he has a speculation about that I'll get into in a second. And finally, the Neimoidians still have the shipment of Cortosis to Rugus Nome or Damask Holdings. So, all right, so let me mention the planet. So the potential planet that he's speculating is Bnic, if I'm pronouncing that right. And Dale's actually pulling from some deep legend stuff. So Bnic is a planet that figures in the history of Darth Tenebris and Darth Plagueis. So getting into the rule of two and the line of succession that happens with Sith Lords and Sith apprentices. And in legend storytelling, this planet Baldemnik is one that had large deposits of cortosis. That's the metal that we hear talked about in the Acolyte that Darth Manny uses for his helmet and gauntlets that can briefly neutralize lightsabers. There's a mining company that lets Darth Tenebris know this. Darth Tenebris is the Sith Master of Darth Plagueis, who, of course, in turn, is the Sith Master to Darth Sidious, aka Palpatine. And some of the descriptions of Baldemnik in Legends are in line with what we see in the Acolyte. However, the planet is supposed to have a very noxious atmosphere and really not very, livable, not very habitable for most sentient beings. But what we're seeing in the Acolyte certainly doesn't seem like that. It seems much more like a milder Octo kind of climate than what Legends depicts Baldemnik as. However, yeah, things can change for sure. At least as part of the reinvention of the Star Wars canon and that level of storytelling, right? And just to close the loop on a couple of Dale's other references, Rugus Gnome is what Darth Tenebris was known as to the wider galaxy, just like Chief Palpatine was Darth Sidious, right? And Damask Holdings is the company owned by Hugo Damask, and Hugo Damask was the given name, birth name of Darth Plagueis. And stuff like that makes me think about Darth Tenebris, the Bith Sith Lord, kicking around in the background, the possibility that he is Darth Manny / Darth Chimere's Sith Lord, and that Osha, if she survives the events of Season 1 of The Acolyte, and if Chimere doesn't, that maybe Osha starts working with Darth Tenebris behind the scenes. That might be a bridge too far in terms of predictions. And so maybe it's just better, after all, to go with the way that Tim McMahon thinks about it. He responded to my inquiry by saying a Yoda cameo, which would be wonderful fun. And just because we've heard in interviews that Vernestra Rwoh was supposed to be the only High Republic character who appears in The Acolyte, a previously established character. Technically speaking, Yoda isn't a High Republic character. Yoda was established separately, so yeah, you can definitely find the loophole that would allow him to appear, even despite what other interviews with various people have said. But even that, I know there's some discourse out there about the interview process for people who are creating shows like this in fandom type universes, and what people say or don't say, and whether they lie or don't lie in interviews. And quite honestly, I don't know. I think I'm okay with all lying by creators in advance of things, because what else are they supposed to do? But I digress. The rest of Tim's comment is, I can't even begin to guess, and that's what I like about this show, is that it has kept me on my toes. And you know what? Generally, I feel the same way about it. I think the only thing that, it hasn't necessarily kept me on my toes personally, and I've talked about this on a previous episode of the podcast, just the structure of the storytelling in terms of the revelations from the flashback sequences, and about how, maybe it's just a factor of the different directors and the shooting schedule as a result, and that you couldn't necessarily give us little piece flashback, spread it out across multiple episodes, so that way the mystery could be unraveled a little bit more slowly. Otherwise, the series hasn't been what I expected, and I mean that in a good way. And certainly episode 5 really just completely destroyed any idea I had about where the series was going to end up going, made me have to rethink the whole thing. On top of the fact that, as I believe it was Daphne Keane who said in interviews, that they were aiming to either match or top the Phantom Menace in terms of lightsaber battle stuff, and I think they did it. I really do. As far as my own thoughts about the rest of the finale, well, we need some kind of rematch or confrontation, and that means getting some of the parties together somewhere. Coruscant doesn't necessarily seem like the right place for it. It seems like it has to happen somewhere else, and Brendock certainly is a very logical place for things to happen, or even one of the moons. Dale even suggested that anybody crashing on the moons could be on one or both of them, for that matter, which would be really intriguing. It seems highly unlikely that it would be the planet where Chimere and Osha are, because that is currently unmapped, so the Jedi wouldn't know where to find it. So it suggests that Chimere and Osha are going to leave the planet and head somewhere for some type of confrontation. We just don't know where yet. But another reason why Coruscant would be the wrong place for a final confrontation is because Vernestra is trying to keep everything under the radar, doesn't want this, senator who's investigating the Jedi Order to get wind of something like this, or who wants an external audit of the Jedi Order. So if Saul wants to meet, wants to talk about what happened on Brendock, wants to spill his guts and confess his sins, then Vernestra's probably going to say, yeah, not here, and end up meeting them somewhere else. I think that's as far as I'm going to go with predictions at this point, but I'd love to know what you think. And again, your predictions got to be in comments before 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific here in the United States. Otherwise, they don't count. So if you're catching this on YouTube, comments are right there. On Spotify, Q&A section is there. Anywhere else, head to the blog post for this show's episode at sw7x7.com and let me know what you think. And that is going to do it for this episode of the podcast. If you enjoy the show, please help me help more people find out about this Daily Dose of Star Wars Joy. You can do that by just telling people, by telling algorithms with likes and comments and ratings and reviews and follows and joins and all that stuff. And you can even help me as an independent creator keep producing this Dose of Star Wars Joy, and you can learn more about that at patreon.com/SW7x7. And it just remains for me to say thank you so much for joining me for this episode of the podcast as always, and may the Force be with you wherever in the world you may be.
7x7 is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars-related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited, or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyright by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.